Hello, my name is Luke Cordo, and I will be sharing with you an interesting fact about one of the biggest entertainment industries today, the video game industry. The entertainment industry has been one of the biggest money-generating empires, and at the throat of this empire sits two champions, movies and video games. For the longest time, the movie TV industry has been a successful monopoly through a formula of emotions and actions that attract populaces. As these formulas are being used, the film industry has embedded a series of cliches and stereotypes that we absorb culturally. The rapid evolution of video games after the 20th century allowed viewers or players to be entertained by the advancements in the graphics, gameplay. Well, let's just face it was just like you were playing a movie that you can interact with. Despite being the youngest form of media, the industry's revenue for 2013 totaled $66 billion. Well, it shouldn't be too surprising. After all, if you really look at it, the video game industry usually uses practically the same formula that most media use to generate public interest. To prove this, I have created this video for your viewing and hope you'll enjoy watching it. Like movies, video games create alternative universes which players become enthralled by. These universes, however, are capable of generating obvious and less than obvious stereotypes that could leak into our social behavior, marginalizing our view on society from its effects. Such stereotypes are found in the cultural, ethnical, and gender depictions found in these video games. When it comes to video games, the main character is never born from the lower class. Traditionally, the main character is normally born from either an upper-class aristocracy or to a middle-class family that hovers on the edge of either being poor or rich. These avatars, once playable by the user, normally start in their 20s or 30s. Characters in the lower class threshold tend to play insignificant or, in a lot of cases, a villainous role. For villains, there are two roles, the henchmen and the bosses. Henchmen are usually played by characters who are of a lower social class or a form of mercenary force which throws itself at your avatar, ignoring its eventual fate. Bosses in video games come in two personas, the lunatic and the maestro. The lunatic is normally a first or second round boss that stands at the apex of the lower class henchmen. While he may not be the strongest of bosses in the game, they can be an intimidating character. This is mainly due to the fact that the bosses tend to be mentally unstable and thus unpredictable. This stereotype therefore creates a negative psychological impact on the player in regards to lower class and homeless people who are at times mentally deteriorating in real life.
But what fun would that be? Not a fitting end at all. The boss's apprentice. I will give you fear such as you've never experienced before. Come into my web. It is time for you to feel the fear.
Maestros, on the other hand, are higher level bosses, normally at the pinnacle of the middle class or even upper class in cultural standards. They are the conductors of the upper and lower class henchmen, usually explaining to the avatar that their goal is pointless in continuing. Villains like Albert Wesker from Resident Evil 5 show a good profile of what one would describe as a Maestro class villain. When it comes to the ethnical position of video games, it can be simply divided into two groups, whites and everybody else. According to a census done in 2013, white people represented 80% of all video game characters.
No way!
Yes way. This is mainly due to the fact that white characters are capable of playing any role in the game, from the main protagonist to the main villain. A great example can be found in the game Heavenly Sword, where all the characters are Asian, yet the main villain is Caucasian. Other ethnic backgrounds for characters are limited since other races make up for 13% of all video game characters. Cultures like Southern America, Africa, and the Middle East are treated as hostile with no sense of stability, which becomes easy in finding henchmen. If there are, however, any non-villainous characters of an ethnic background, then their role is limited and usually results in their scripted death. African Americans, however, are a tricky sort, since they can play a role both for and against the protagonist. They are typically successful in the field they cover, yet they do not hold a stake in the power of the game itself. In the game Metal Gear Solid 4, the character Drebin projects himself as a successful weapons launderer, and while he has his appearance throughout the game, his role in the game is limited only to specific jobs, such as buying and selling weapons to Snake.
Consider it a welcome gift. Take it. The M4, the official carbine model used by the U.S. Army, developed from the M16 service rifle. This one's a top-of-the-line model, real popular with the big PMCs.
Video games are also able to influence us from an international standpoint. First-person shooters are well known for their present political settings, which can influence users as to what nations we should concern ourselves with. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare, we see at the beginning of the game a modern version of political relations towards two culturally established enemies.
Good news first, the world's in great shape. We've got a civil war in Russia, government loyalists against ultranationalist rebels, and 15,000 nukes at stake.
Just another day at the office.
Khaled al-Assad, currently the second most powerful man in the Middle East. Now word on the street is he's got the minerals to be top dog down there. Intel's keeping an eye on him.
And the bad news?
We've got a new guy joining us today, fresh out of selection. His name's Soap.
Of all these subliminal stereotypes found in games, the most obvious I would have to say is gender. Both men and women are given a simple depiction regarding their appearance and personalities. The formula for this is so simple that it severely limits the variety of protagonists, which therefore limits the psychological perspective that only avatars of this nature are only capable of such success. Men, for example, are objectified mainly by their physical features. Your typical male protagonist tends to be very physically fit, almost to a point of a natural athlete or military-trained figure. In addition, a male character is likely to be intimidating by nature in what they intend on doing in the game, making others around them compliant. But as much as men are objectified, women are even far worse objectified. In any video game, unless the character has a specific need to be ugly, you will not find a subpar attractive female in a video game. Around 95% of all females in video games are considered to have model or above attractive qualities. One of the more common body shapes is the hourglass shape, with thin torsos, round posteriors, and large bosoms. If that's not enough, the wardrobe of women is very provocative, which complements their figure to act as a representation of the sexuality of females in video games. Personality-wise as well adds to that need to use their sexuality to remain close to a male character, becoming dependent on them. Excella from Resident Evil 5 provides the perfect example of a very attractive woman using her sexuality and dependence on the main villain, Wesker.
To join you in your new world, I believe I've proven I'm worthy, haven't I?
Perhaps you have.
The BSA, they're here.
It appears your old friend, Chris Redfield, has come to pay you a visit. To Do I sense concern?
The plan is in its final stages. I will not tolerate delays.
Perhaps one of the more public concerning aspects of the video game formula is the game violence. If you were to ask your common adult whether violence from movies, or in this case video games, have an effect towards people, most would say yes. The public has always had a growing concern towards the violence in video games, identifying violence in a negative context. However, media literacy scholar James Potter writes, "When people are limited by a narrow perspective on a problem, they are prevented from seeing many of the problem's key facts, and this limitation will distort their perceptions and prevent their criticism from being useful." In reality, the concept of violence in view of the populace can be broken down into three characteristics: graphicness, justification, and comedy. Justified violence is a form of violence that is not met with a strong negative response. To be more specific, justification focuses on the reason for that violence. The user is able to establish a common relation with the avatar, which allows him to focus on the protagonist's personality and actions towards the victim. In a way, this is a form of physiological habituation, since the body is able to resist the psychological exposure of game violence. Comic, or happy violence, on the other hand, is a form of violence which is intended to be humorous and therefore not serious. This form of violence reduces the immediate threat towards users, who are encouraged to laugh at the violent actions. When humor is applied to violence, many people don't even perceive the action as even being violent. One of the best known examples comes from the game Super Mario Bros., where the protagonist's main form of violence was simply jumping on top of someone. As games evolved, so did the interpretation of happy violence, like in the game Kung Fu Rider. Violence of a more graphic nature is the most commonly displeasing form of violence to the public today. This is because violence of this nature is capable of completely interrupting our sense of enjoyment to the game. Such graphicness is especially common with games of the recent generation. Another concern about this form of violence is that it can dull the senses of the gamer. By then, graphic violence becomes a stimulant that forces the user to seek out far greater graphic games until it becomes practically an addiction. This is a textbook example of narcoticizing, where graphic violence is used as the arousal jag. What we see here is a fine example of what happens when video games decide to go Hollywood. They are now a billionaire giant, but like movies, have fallen victim to the cliches of standard medias that stereotype and objectify different characters. The important fact to consider about all this is that movies and video games are both works of fictional material, especially video games, and thus should never be taken completely seriously. However, if society continues to be so enthralled by video games, it runs the risk on relying on them for cultural and ethnic gender messages that these works of fiction delusion us with.
In between the lines, there's a lot of obscurity. I'm not inclined to resign to maturity. If it's alright, then you're all wrong. But why bounce around to the same damn song? You'd rather run when you can't crawl. I know, you know that I'm not telling the truth. I know, you know, they just don't have any proof. It's the deception, learn how to bend your worst inhibitions, then psych you out in the end.
What do you think about that? Yeah, I think somebody owes me the last 2 minutes of my life back.